Okay, welcome back. It's time to cover Chapter 15, which is Social Psychology in the Court. All right, this chapter has a lot of videos embedded in the playlist, so brace yourself for lots of illustrations. In fact, speaking of illustrations, let's start off with a nice illustration of one of the concepts that we're going to be talking about. So what I'm going to do is ask you to listen to a list of 15 words, and you can do whatever you want in your mind to try and remember the words, but don't write them down until I tell you to go. Okay, so gather a piece of paper and a pencil so that you can do the memory retrieval at the end, and pause me if you need to go find something. So hopefully we all have a paper and something with which to write, and don't write as I read the words. This is a memory test. So I'm going to read 15 words to you. You're going to do the best that you can to remember all 15, and then when I say go, you're going to write them down in any order from memory on the paper. Okay, so hopefully everybody gets the task. Here we go. Table, sit, legs, seat, couch, desk, recliner, sofa, wood, cushion, swivel, stool, sitting, rocking, bench. All right, write down as many of those words as you can remember in any order. Go. I'm going to say you might want to pause me. Okay, so hopefully you've written down as many words as you possibly can in any order. You know that there were 15 to start with. My guess is that you wrote down fewer than 15 because that's pretty typical. Free recall is a tough task. You have to generate possible alternatives to write down. Your brain then has to say, I don't know, was that something that was on the list or not? And then you have to write it down. And so as you're writing one word down, you're kind of forgetting others that you might have had just tenuously stored in your short-term memory. It's a tough task. So let's make it a little bit easier now by giving you a recognition task. And so what you're going to see next is a list of words. You're going to notice that there are actually 16 words on the list. So I want you to go through the 16 words, and for one thing, you'll be able to verify that the ones that you wrote down in the free recall task were actually on the list. And then your secondary task is to find the one word that was not on the list that I read out loud. All right, so here is the actual list that you're going to be comparing to, and your job is to verify that what you wrote down were all valid words. Notice that some of the words on the list you may now recognize that you hadn't been able to generate as a free recall. And then find that one word that was not on the original list. You can go ahead and pause me if you want to do a little bit of investigating and stuff. All right, so hopefully we're all back. You've all figured out, whether your free recall words were accurate, recognized some extra words, and maybe have an idea of what the one word is that I didn't say. The one word that I didn't say was chair. And if you don't believe it, you're lucky. You're an online student. You can go back in that lecture, listen to me reading out loud, and you will not hear the word chair. But a lot of people write down the word chair when given this task, because chair is the one thing that ties all these 15 words together, right? They all relate to each other only through the concept of chair. So for a lot of people, to boost our memory of the words, we actually detect the pattern and we go ahead and think to ourselves even, oh, these all have to do with chairs. And so for a lot of people, the very first word they write down is the word chair. That word chair is you drawing an inference. That's you understanding the relationship among all these pieces of information and imposing an overarching story. In this case, the story is they all relate to chair. This is a really important exercise as we enter into a discussion about eyewitness recognition and other kinds of errors that can happen in the legal system, when we make these kinds of errors on something that is as low stakes as trying to remember 15 words that we heard read out loud, you can imagine the errors that we might make in a high stakes situation, like when we're scared because we were victimized by a crime, or we are currently in a jury listening to the testimony and the evidence. These kinds of natural cognitive shortcuts that we take, which allow us to look for patterns and to draw inferences, can have big repercussions when we're talking about the legal system. So let's get started on eyewitness identification. There are a lot of variables that can influence the identification that an eyewitness might make. One of them is what we call estimator variables. These are characteristics of the eyewitness and the situation that can influence their recollection of the appearance of the perpetrator. So characteristics of the situation, viewing conditions. Here we have it looks like it's dark, it's foggy. These viewing conditions are probably not going to be ideal for an accurate recognition of someone. Arousal, we've been using that word a lot in this class. We don't mean sexual arousal, we mean physiological arousal. So your heart rate's up, your pupils are really dilated, all the things that happen when the sympathetic nervous system is activated. And those factors can cause us to be less attentive to all details. We may only be really paying attention to the details that are most eliciting the arousal. So for a lot of people, they just fixate on the weapon. Or they're so busy thinking, how am I going to get out of this situation, that they're not thinking about what does this person look like, or what does their voice sound like, or any of those kinds of things. A lot of times people develop weapon focus. Like I said, because they're so aroused by the fear, they can't take their eyes off of the thing that they're the most scared of. And so they might be able to give a pretty decent description of the weapon, but not a very good description of the person who's wielding the weapon. We all make own race bias errors. We tend to see detailed differences more clearly among people of our own race and less clearly among people of other races. So with our own race, we might notice eye shape or skin texture or length of hair or other kinds of things more readily. And we may gloss over those details when making assessments of people from another race. And we've seen it in every cross-race identification. A lot of people used to call this, I've forgotten the kind of pejorative term that they used to use for it, but it indicated that white people can't tell the difference between black people. And it turns out it's not a white error that is made towards people who are non-white. It's people making those errors towards people who are from another race. And it has to do with not really picking up the details. That's where the error lies. The more experience that a person has with more people from another race, the less likely they are to display this error. So in communities where there's a lot of diversity, we tend to see less of this own race bias, but it's a very common error. All people tend to do it across race. What's really weird is that no matter how much you talk about these estimator variable problems, it doesn't necessarily affect the witness's confidence about their eyewitness identification. If you say to them, well, it was kind of foggy that night. Are you sure that you really saw what you think you saw? Or, you really thoroughly described the gun. So is it possible you really weren't looking at the perpetrator's face? Oh, no, I really saw it. And this is who I think it was. Even as you tell them about the weaknesses in eyewitness ability to tell the difference in individuals in another race, they still will say, no, I understand other people make that mistake, but I'm seeing it correctly. I'm making the right, identification. And so educating the eyewitness doesn't necessarily cause them to say, well, then I'm actually, I'm not sure. They just become maybe more dug in. Now, there are also system variables that are under the control of the legal system that can influence the identification that the eyewitness makes. Suggestive questioning is one example of a system variable. So this was discovered in the mid-1970s by Elizabeth Loftus at the University of Washington. And what she did was she videotaped, they didn't have videotape back then, she like film strip taped a car accident. It was a mock car accident. Showed the video to all the participants and told them that they're going to serve as eyewitnesses in this so-called trial of this car accident. For half of the students who watched the video, when they were questioned at the trial, the lawyer asked them how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. And for the other half of the students, the lawyer asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. So the only thing different in the question is the word hit versus the words smashed into. And what happened was that the eyewitnesses estimated a faster speed at the time of the accident. They estimated more broken glass on the ground when they heard the word smashed into. Smashed into led the eyewitnesses to conclude they must have been going pretty fast. There must have been a lot of smashing, or the lawyer wouldn't have said that. Like, that's the kind of reasoning that the suggestive questioning led to. Whereas with the verb hit, they saw less broken glass in their memories. They recalled the cars traveling slower in their memories. So that kind of suggestive questioning can lead the eyewitness to say things that aren't exactly accurate, right? So we're not supposed to ask those kinds of questions in legal settings anymore. You're supposed to ask how fast were the cars going. That's it. Lineup procedures would be another system variable, another thing that's under the control of the legal system. Here I've got a cartoon. Everybody else looks exactly the same, and then you get the one perpetrator that looks different from everybody else, really sweating it out. I have lined up in the playlist an example of a lineup procedure, how it can go faulty. So unfortunately, I couldn't embed it into this slide. So it's next up in the playlist. Go ahead and watch that, and we'll come back and talk a little bit about what you saw on the other side.